Audience discretion is advised due to potentially distressing and sensitive material. Hi everyone and welcome to Crime Alley Documentaries. Today we're going to talk about one of the most famous unsolved cases of Germany. So before we start, I just want to personally apologize for any names that may be pronounced incorrectly. The farm was located approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich, Germany. It was a small Bavarian farmstead. There lived a family of five: Andreas Gruber, age 63, his wife Cazelia Gruber, age 72, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, age 35, and Victoria's children, Cazelia, age 7, who was named after her grandmother, and Joseph, age 2. The family had a living maid called Crescence Rieger. They were known to keep to themselves, but they also showed up to church every Sunday and were said to be of great wealth. But in the last 6 months or so, Andreas was telling neighbors of the weird things that were going on at the farm, things they couldn't explain. And this was altogether odd because he was known to be extremely reserved. He told his neighbors that the family heard footsteps in the attic, but when he went to investigate, there was no one up there. Another incident he talked about was that he'd found a strange newspaper from Munich on his property, but he couldn't remember ordering it, and thought the postman had made a mistake. But then he'd come to learn that none of his neighbors had ordered the newspaper. The most disturbing thing was that after a heavy snowfall, the family found footprints leading from the forest to the farm, but no footprints led back, and it belonged to none of the family members. Also, one of their house keys had gone missing. The neighbors urged Andreas to report the events to the police, but he said this was all nonsense and there was nothing really worth reporting. Now imagine that the living quarters, the stable and the barn were all connected, under the same roof, and only separated by interior walls and doors, and the attic upstairs was completely open and accessible by ladder from both the residence and the barn, which made it all even creepier because the whole house and family were kind of exposed. Reportedly, it was the footprints and the footsteps that were the last straw for the maid. She quit on the spot and started telling the village people that the farm was haunted and she would never work there again. She was so creeped out by the whole thing. It was March 31st, 1922, when a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the farm being escorted by her sister, who left her after a very short stay. Some say that Maria was actually the sister of the maid who'd quit 6 months earlier and who'd introduced her sister to the family as a replacement. What was strange to their neighbors was that none of the family members were seen at the farm after the new maid arrived. I mean, the animals were being fed and the farm was being taken care of, but the family didn't even show up to the service that Sunday. People started wondering where they were and started to grow concerned because it was impossible for them to miss the Sunday service, but they still saw that smoke was coming out of the chimney, which suggested that they were either cooking or keeping themselves warm just like everyone else. And this stopped the villagers from jumping to conclusions, even though it was reported that Cazelia Gabriel, the 7-year-old girl, was also absent from school without excuse. On April 1st, Hans Skarowski and Edward Skarowski, who were coffee sellers, arrived at the farm and found it empty. It was a total ghost town. They started knocking on the doors and windows to find someone, but after no one answered, they just left. The only thing they noticed was that the gate to the machine house was open. Local mechanic Albert Hofner showed up at the farm on April 4th to repair an engine that Andreas had discussed with him. When he got to the farm, he saw no one. He waited around for an hour, walking around and looking for the residents. Then he just spent approximately 4.5 hours repairing the engine and left. Lawrence Schlittenbauer was their closest neighbor in distance. After hearing that none of the family members had been seen in a few days, he sent his 16-year-old son Johann and 9-year-old stepson Joseph to check on them. They made their way to the farm hoping to make contact with the family, but again they saw nothing and no one. After hearing this from his sons, Lawrence gathered two of his friends, Michael Paul and Jacob Siegel, and headed to the farm to search for them. They entered the barn and there found the bodies of Andreas, his wife Casilia, their daughter Victoria, and their granddaughter Casilia. They found Maria Baumberger's body in the house, and 2-year-old Joseph was beaten to death in his bassinet. Inspector George Ringrober was in charge of the murder investigation, but he had a rough road ahead of him because it is reported that the crime scene had been tampered with. Some sources say by the number of people who had interacted with the crime scene and moved items and bodies around and even cooked meals in the kitchen, while other sources report that the only person who was cooking in the kitchen was the murderer, and the only person tampering with the bodies was the neighbor, Lawrence. But no matter which one you believe, apparently the murderer had stayed at the farm for 4 days after murdering the residents. The perpetrator had fed the cattle, eaten an entire supply of bread from the kitchen, and had recently cut meat from the pantry. And this explained why, for 4 days after the arrival of the new maid, even though none of the family members were physically seen by anyone and were actually lying dead in the barn, there were reports of seeing chimney smoke and other activities taking place on the farm, like the animals being fed. Further evidence of the murderer living there was the roof tiles, which had been removed, presumably for the murderer to keep a lookout for unexpected visitors to the farm. There was also a carpet placed on the floor to muffle the footsteps. There were ropes attached to the beams in the barn, which indicated that the murderer was trying to make a way out for himself to escape. Someone had also defecated in the hayloft. A day after the discovery of the bodies, court physician Johann Baptist was sent over to the farm to perform autopsies on the victims inside the barn. He found that the most probable murder weapon was a mattock, which is a type of agricultural tool shaped like a pickaxe. The victims had suffered brutal injuries. The elderly Casilia had 8 holes in the right side of her skull. Her daughter Victoria's skull had 9. There were also strangulation marks found on Victoria's neck, which to me mean that Victoria had a big part in how this whole evening played out. After all, strangulation means that the murderer had a bone to pick with her, and perhaps her family was just in the way. Victoria's daughter had 1 hole in the right side of her face. She had also suffered a crushed jaw, which resulted from the murderer using an iron band on her to make her quiet. Sadly, the fatal injury for her was a slit throat by a pocket knife. In her small hands, they had found clumps of her own hair, which she had pulled out due to being in pain and shock. She had been alive for hours after the attack. In the beginning of the investigation, they failed to locate the murder weapon, but after further search of the house, they eventually found it in a cavity up above the kitchen in a false flooring space. The weapon was 80 centimeters long and was known to have been designed by Andreas himself, who had made it to kill cattle. 7-year-old Casilia was also half naked, which suggested that the murderer had attempted to rape her, although I couldn't find anything on whether she was raped or not, because I guess they couldn't tell for sure because it was the 1920s. Andreas, Victoria's father's death, was however the strangest. He was found to have died from a fall onto the tip of the heavy pickaxe. The tool had torn open his carotid artery and he bled out in a very short time. The flesh was torn open on the right side of his cheek and the cheekbone protruded. He'd suffered this one single injury. The murderer had partially hidden the bodies, covering them with hay. Maria, the maid, had suffered injuries to the face on the right side of her head and had one hole in the top of her skull, and Joseph, the 2-year-old, had died from a single blow to the right side of his skull. At first, it was believed that the motive for killing the family was robbery, but after further investigation, it was revealed that there was actually a large amount of money that was left untouched, and the theory went out the window. Although the police did take the time to interrogate traveling craftsmen, vagrants, and several inhabitants from the surrounding villages to rule this out. Interestingly, even though robbery was ruled out as a motive, and this is a very small village we're talking about, the suspect list was really long, and there were many weird and suspicious reports concerning the farm. For example, the night after the crime took place, the artisan Michael Plux was passing by the family farm when he saw the oven had been heated by someone, and that person did approach him with a lantern. But the lantern blinded Michael, and the person hastily walked away as if wanting to hide his face. All Michael remembered other than this was that the chimney was emanating a revolting smell, like burned rocks, but the lead was never followed. I mean, what was being burned that night was never investigated. Simon Ray Blander reported seeing two mysterious figures on the side of the road on the edge of the forest on April 1st. But the second they saw Simon, they turned around so he wouldn't be able to identify them. This was a strange occurrence to Simon, and he reported that the two mysterious figures could be involved in the crime. It was reported by another resident of Whitehaven that a stranger stopped him in his tracks to ask about the murders after they had already occurred. It was the middle of May 1927, and they started shouting that he was the murderer and ran into the woods. He was never found or identified. But as for the police, their first suspect was Carl Gabriel. Now, doesn't that name sound familiar somehow? He was the deceased husband of Victoria, who had been killed in December 1914 during World War I. Apparently, his body was never found, and it was speculated that he was still alive and kicking and had come back and killed the family. Now here's the twist. Victoria's second child, 2-year-old Joseph, was conceived after Victoria's husband had been declared dead, so obviously he wasn't the father. Rumor has it that Carl comes back to find that the little boy was the product of an incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father, which made Carl fly into a rage and murder the whole family. Honestly, you can say that this was just a rumor because Andreas and Victoria had both been accused of the crime and had spent time in jail. Andreas served a year and Victoria served 1 month. Though another thing you should know, which I found both sick and interesting, was that Andreas was apparently not the greatest dad in the world. It is said that Andreas was extremely aggressive with not only his wife and children, but also his neighbors. He even went as far as attacking people with dangerous and sharp objects if he got mad, like a pitchfork or a shotgun. And he was known to lock his children in the cellar for days on end during the winter, and one of his daughters named Sophie had actually died because of the abuse. Some say he had other children other than Victoria and Sophie, but none of them survived except for Victoria, who was allegedly being raped by her dad. Some who had returned from war reported that Carl was still alive and well, and some testified that they'd seen him die and even saw his corpse. But either way, why would he murder Cecilia, his own daughter? I can understand the sick logic behind killing the baby or Victoria's dad or even Victoria herself, but why his own daughter? Maybe she got in the way? I don't know, it just doesn't sit right with me. It was also believed that Lawrence was in a romantic relationship with Victoria. Now, do you remember who this was? This was the Grubers' closest neighbor who sent his son and stepson to check on the family, and he was the neighbor who discovered the bodies with 2 of his friends after his sons reported that there was no one on the farm. Well, firstly, police were suspicious of Lawrence because shortly after the death of his first wife in 1918, he started seeing Victoria. But apparently, after Andreas started showing his disapproval of the relationship, knowing Andreas, he probably even threatened both of them, the relationship ended and Lawrence met and married another woman. And why wouldn't Andreas put a stop to the relationship if he was really abusing Victoria? So, because of this relationship, some believe that Lawrence was actually Joseph's biological father, and there is more to this. As reported, right after finding the bodies of the four family members, Lawrence went to the front door, took out the key, and unlocked the door, and let himself in. When he was asked by his companions why he had the key or why he went in alone even though the murderer could still be there, he replied that he went to look for his son Joseph. Another reason why investigators were suspicious of him was why in the first place did he have the keys to the house, though I think this could be explained away by the fact that firstly, he was the closest living neighbor and he may have been given a spare key in cases of emergencies just like this one. Or since he was Victoria's lover, she may have been the one who had handed him the key. But what is even weirder is that Lawrence was known to have disturbed the bodies at the crime scene and compromised the investigation. Why would he do that? Maybe having no knowledge of how detrimental he was being to the case being solved, or maybe covering his own tracks? He remained on the investigators' radar for years after the murders, cause locals reported hearing strange comments from him, which hinted at the fact that he had more knowledge about the murders than anyone else would have, like the kind of knowledge only the murderer would have. One local reported that one day he saw Lawrence visiting the demolished farm in 1925, and when he asked why he was there, Lawrence replied that the perpetrator had attempted to bury the family's bodies in the barn but couldn't because the ground was frozen. But then again, since he lived nearby and had intimate knowledge of the lands, it could have just been an educated guess. So what was his motive, you may ask? It was speculated that Lawrence had murdered the family after Victoria demanded financial support for their son Joseph. Another belief was that Lawrence had learned of the incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father, and this was the reason he had committed the crime. Anyhow, before his death in 1941, Lawrence conducted and won several civil claims for slander against the people who had described him as the murderer of the family. But the list of suspects goes on. There were the Grump brothers, whose sister had claimed on her deathbed that Adolf and Anton had committed the murders, but they were both dismissed as suspects while Adolf had already died. There was no proof of their involvement, although they were also said to have participated in the murder of 9 farmers during the fight against the 1921 uprising in the region and looked like good suspects. Therese T. in a letter stated that when she was 12, her mother received a visit from the mother of the brothers Carl and Andreas and claimed that her sons were responsible for the murders. The mother said, quote, Andreas regretted that he lost his penknife, end quote, on the night of the murders, and the penknife was in fact found after the farm was demolished in 1923. But the penknife could have easily belonged to anyone on the farm, so they were also cleared as suspects. Joseph Betts was another individual who came forward with claims against his previous roommate Peter Weber. He claimed that while the two were roommates and working as laborers in 1919 to 1920, Weber had told him about this farm that he knew only an old couple lived on, with their widowed daughter and her 2 children, and had suggested that they kill the old man and take the family money. After Bess showed his lack of interest in committing murder, Weber stopped talking about it altogether. The claims never went anywhere. The former maid Crescence Rieger named brothers Anton and Carl Bickler as suspects. She said that Anton had helped with the potato harvest on the farm and knew the premises, and the brothers often talked about the family and their fortune and tried to milk her for information. As she claimed, The brothers even went as far as talking about murdering the family. She added a suspect to her list, George Siegel, who had worked on the farm and knew of the family fortune, and said that he'd supposedly broken into the home once and had stolen a number of items, though he denied everything. She also put forth the theory of the Tala brothers being the culprits, because they were known to have committed minor burglaries in the area right before the murders, and they also asked her for information on the family, to which she never responded. Apparently, during a conversation, Joseph Tala even claimed to have knowledge of the blueprint of the house and knowing which family members slept in which room, and also knew of the family fortune. But seeing that this was a small village, I think people generally knew of each other's financial status, and this wouldn't yield solid suspects. Another interesting theory can be found in author Bill James's book entitled The Man from the Train, where he speaks of a man named Paul Mueller, a German migrant. The author believed that this man was responsible for killing dozens of victims based on research in American newspaper archives. There was also this other famous family murder in 1898, a Massachusetts family, and it bore some similarities to this murder. The murderer slaughtered the family in their isolated homes and used the blunt edge of farm tools as a weapon. He moved and stacked the victims' bodies on top of each other, and there was no robbery. But to us, the most intriguing theory is that Andreas Gruber was the murderer who killed his whole family in cold blood. This theory could account for the reason behind the killer choosing to stay at the farm with the bodies for 4 days. He had nowhere to go. He went on with his everyday life, tending to the farm and the animals, cooked meals for himself, and even tore off the date on the family calendar the day after the murders. This would also explain why and how the murderer had intimate knowledge of the farm, like the loose tile he hid the murder weapon behind. But why did he kill them? Well, it is said that Andreas at some point found the true identity of Victoria's son's father, and as everyone knew, he was into the habit of beating his daughter. So when he found out, he flew into a rage and intended to hurt or even kill his own daughter, but was stopped by the rest of the family, and that's why they were all killed. He, as the evidence suggests, even attempted to rape Victoria's daughter. Add to this the fact that Andreas was a known rapist. This theory could be backed up by the fact that, as reported by 7-year-old Cazilia's friend, the night before the murders, Victoria had gotten into an argument with her parents and ran into the forest in an attempt to run away or get away from them, and had been found hours later in the forest. This could suggest that maybe that was the night when Andreas had found out about the true paternity of his grandson. Another evidence could be that Victoria once told Lawrence, quote, "That's the better thing, that I'm pregnant by father. Otherwise, he would beat me to death." End quote. Others suggest that the whole family murder happened because Andreas was trying to rape Victoria's daughter, and Victoria and her mother intervened, and that is why they were all bludgeoned to death. But if you believe this theory to be true, another question presents itself. How did Andreas die? Did he intentionally fall and kill himself? Well, they say that because Lawrence knew that Joseph was his son, he went over to the barn like he'd done hundreds of times before, but couldn't find anyone. It was likely that since Andreas couldn't bury the bodies because of the frozen ground, he would hide away from anyone visiting the barn. But Andreas was surprised when Lawrence made his way right to the barn after not finding anyone at the house, and found Andreas and the bodies at the barn. It is suggested that after finding his son's body as well, Lawrence pushed Andreas and he ended up with a pickaxe in his face, severing his artery. And this is why he sent his sons to the farm to check on the family days after. He needed time to think about his next move, and he knew that the real killer was dead and his sons wouldn't be in any immediate danger. Then he takes 2 people with him to the barn to find the bodies as witnesses, and finds the bodies for the second time. And maybe that is why he knew the murderer had attempted to bury the bodies but was unsuccessful. Perhaps he'd caught him in the act. Not to mention that Andreas was found in his sleeping clothes. Maybe he was trying to bury them at nighttime when he was sure no one would show up to the farm. But despite many suspects and years of investigation, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved to this day. The investigation was officially closed in 1955 since there was no usable evidence. After years of analyzing the crime, the only conclusion was that, quote, the crime was triggered by a personal emotional conflict, end quote. But on the bright side, the Hinterkaifeck case had significant impact on the field of forensic science. The mistakes made were studied, like the contamination of the crime scene or the delay in examination, and this highlighted proper crime scene protocols. This case was a catalyst for the development of procedures in forensic investigation. Please leave any theories or comments you might have for us down below. We're really interested to know what you think about this case.